$86. In today's world, that barely buys you a decent steak dinner for two. But in the bitter winter of 1998, it bought a 72-year-old man named Elias Callaway 320 acres of prime, untouched timberland. It was the steal of the century. But what Elias didn't know, as he handed over a crisp $100 bill, was that he wasn't just buying dirt and pine trees. He was buying a 50-year-old blood feud. Elias Callaway was a man who lived his life by the rhythm of the rising sun and the slow drip of a percolator. At 72 years old, his hands were mapped with the scars of a lifetime spent turning wrenches and pulling cabs. He lived alone in a drafty, single-story farmhouse on the outskirts of Garrison County, Montana. His wife, Martha, had passed away 6 years prior, leaving him with a quiet house, a modest pension, and a habit of reading the Garrison County Tribune from front to back every single Tuesday morning. Elias wasn't looking for wealth. He was looking for a distraction from the silence. It was mid-November, the kind of morning where the frost on the window panes looked like jagged teeth. Elias sat at his chipped formica kitchen table, adjusting his bifocals as he flipped past the local sports section, past the obituaries, and into the dense, gray columns of the legal notices. Most folks skipped the legal section. It was nothing but zoning variances, probate notices, and the dry, bureaucratic throat-clearing of local government. But Elias read it with the diligence of a scholar. That was when his index finger, stained with grease that never quite washed out, stopped over a tiny block of text at the bottom of page 14. Notice of public auction for delinquent taxes. Parcel ID 44-09-882-B, 320 acres. Legal description: the northwest quarter and southwest quarter of Section 12, Township 4 North, Range 7 West. Owner of record, estate of Roman T. Abernathy / Fidelity Trust and Management. Unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest, $86.24. Auction date, November 14th, 10 a.m. Room 104, Garrison County Courthouse. Elias blinked. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm, and put them back on. The numbers hadn't changed. 320 acres, $86.24. He knew that land. Everyone in Garrison County who had gray hair knew the old Abernathy tract. It was a massive, sprawling expanse of old-growth Douglas fir and pristine creeks nestled in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Decades ago, Roman T. Abernathy had been a wealthy lumber baron, but the family had suffered a spectacular collapse in the 1970s after a string of tragic accidents and bitter lawsuits. The surviving heirs had scattered to the winds, leaving the estate in the hands of distant corporate trustees in Chicago who cared nothing for Montana dirt. But $86.24? That didn't make any sense. The property taxes on 320 acres of timberland should have been thousands of dollars a year. Elias didn't finish his coffee. He grabbed his heavy wool coat and drove his beat-up Ford F-15 into town. The Garrison County Records Office smelled of floor wax and decaying paper. Behind the heavy oak counter stood Sarah Jenkins, a woman who had worked for the county since the Carter administration. "Morning, Elias," Sarah said, adjusting her cardigan. "What brings you out in this freeze?" "Morning, Sarah. I need to pull the plat maps and the tax history for Parcel 4-9-882-B, the old Abernathy place." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You and half the state, Elias. Or you would be if anyone else had noticed it. She pulled a heavy leather-bound ledger from the back room and slammed it on the counter, dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light. I saw that notice go into the paper yesterday. Figured it was a typo by the assessor's office. Is it? Elias asked, his voice low. Sarah traced her finger down the ledger. No, it's a bizarre legal loophole. You see, back in 1981, Fidelity Trust and Management paid a lump sum to prepay the property taxes for 20 years. They overpaid by a fraction of a percent due to an estimation error. The land sat untouched. But last year, a special county assessment was passed for rural fire management, a flat fee of exactly $80 per parcel. The prepaid account was drained. Fidelity Trust dissolved 3 years ago, meaning there was no one to send the bill to. With penalties, the balance is exactly $86.24. And by Montana state law, if a property is delinquent for over 300 days with no contact from an owner of record, it goes to public tax auction to recoup the deficit. Elias stared at the ledger. So, whoever pays the $86 gets the deed? Whoever has the highest bid over $86, Sarah corrected. But Elias, don't get your hopes up. It's an open auction. When the big developers in Missoula catch wind of this, they'll show up with briefcases full of cash. That land is worth at least $2 million. It's going to be a bidding war. Elias nodded slowly. He thanked Sarah and walked back out into the biting cold. He knew she was right. Wealthy men with lawyers and deep pockets would descend on the courthouse like vultures. A retired mechanic with a few $100s in his savings account didn't stand a chance. But Elias also knew something about Garrison County that city lawyers didn't. He knew the weather. He looked up at the sky. The clouds rolling over the Bitterroot Peaks weren't just gray. They were the color of a bruised plum. The barometer on his porch had been dropping steadily since midnight. A storm was coming. A big one. Elias drove to the local branch of the First National Bank. He walked up to the teller, a young woman named Beatrice, and handed over a withdrawal slip. "Withdrawing $100, Mr. Calloway?" Beatrice asked cheerfully. "Make it in crisp bills, Beatrice, and I'd like 25 cents in change, please." Elias folded the money into his leather wallet. He had 1 week until November 14th. He went home, chopped enough firewood to last a month, and waited. The meteorologist called it the St. Jude's Day ice storm. It didn't just snow. The sky opened up and rained freezing sleet for 36 hours straight. By the morning of Tuesday, November 14th, Garrison County was encased in 2 inches of solid, treacherous ice. Power lines snapped under the weight, plunging half the county into darkness. The interstate was completely shut down. The State Highway Patrol issued a mandatory shelter-in-place order. No one was driving. No one was moving, except Elias Calloway. At 6 a.m., Elias was out in his barn, wrapping heavy-duty iron snow chains around the tires of his Ford. The wind howled, rattling the tin roof, but Elias's hands were steady. He had lived in Montana for 70 years. He respected the ice, but he didn't fear it. The drive to the courthouse, which usually took 20 minutes, took him 2.5 hours. He drove at a crawling pace of 10 miles an hour, navigating roads that looked like a freshly zambonied hockey rink. Several times, the truck fishtailed toward the deep ditches lining Route 9, But Elias expertly pumped the brakes and steered into the skid, keeping the heavy truck on the road. When he finally pulled into the town square of Garrison, it looked like a ghost town. The traffic lights were dead, businesses were boarded up. The massive stone facade of the Garrison County Courthouse loomed in the gray morning light, its steps a treacherous waterfall of frozen ice. Elias strapped a pair of spiked cleats over his work boots and carefully climbed the steps. He pulled the heavy brass handles of the front door. It was unlocked. The county courthouse had a backup generator, casting a dim, flickering yellowish light down the long, empty hallways. He stamped the ice off his boots and walked down the echoing corridor to room 104. He checked his pocket watch. It was 9:45 a.m. He opened the door. The room, lined with rows of wooden benches designed to hold 50 people, was completely empty. At the front of the room, sitting behind a heavy oak desk and looking utterly miserable, was Robert Higgins, the county treasurer. Robert had a thermos of coffee clutched in his hands and was staring blankly at the wall. When the door creaked open, Robert nearly jumped out of his chair. "Elias?" Robert squinted through the gloom. "Good Lord, man. What in heaven's name are you doing out in this? The state police are telling everyone to stay home." "I have business, Robert," Elias said calmly, taking off his hat and shaking the ice from the brim. He walked down the center aisle and took a seat in the very front row. "Business? The whole town is shut down. I only came in because I live 2 blocks away, and the county charter requires a supervisor on duty," Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "The charter also requires tax lien auctions to be held at the published date and time," Elias said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room. "November 14th, 10 o'clock in the morning, room 104. Robert stared at him. Then he looked down at the single manila folder sitting on his desk. He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "You're here for the Abernathy Tract?" "Elias, you've got to be kidding me. I was just about to draft a motion to postpone the sale due to the state of emergency. Half the developers in Missoula called me yesterday begging for a delay. They can't get out of their driveways." Elias leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto Robert's. "Robert, you and I both know the Montana Code Annotated, Title 15, Chapter 17. A tax sale can only be postponed if the courthouse is officially closed by order of a judge, or if the delay is published in the paper of record for 3 consecutive weeks prior. Is the courthouse officially closed?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no. Judge Harmon is stuck in Bozeman, so he couldn't issue the closure order. But Elias, be reasonable. I can't hold an auction with 1 person. The law doesn't specify a minimum attendance, Robert. The law says the property goes to the highest bidder at the published time. If you delay this illegally, those Chicago lawyers will tie this county up in litigation for a decade, claiming you violated due process to favor local buyers. Do you want that on your desk?" Robert swallowed hard. He knew Elias was right. The bureaucratic rigidity of county law was a double-edged sword, and Elias was holding it right to the county's throat. The wall clock ticked loudly. It was 9:58 a.m. "Elias, this is crazy. It's 300 acres. Tick-tock, Robert. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy clock chimed. The sound was deafening in the silent room. Robert sighed in defeat. He picked up a wooden gavel. "All right, fine. Let's get this farce over with. I am opening the public auction for Parcel 4, 4-09-882-B. The opening bid for back taxes, penalties, and interest is set at $86.24. Do I have a bid? $86.24, Elias said clearly. Robert looked around the empty room, as if hoping a billionaire developer might suddenly burst through the walls. I have a bid of $86.24. Do I have any other bids? Going once. Silence. Going twice. A flicker of the backup generator. Sold, Robert said, bringing the gavel down with a sharp clack. To Elias Callaway. God help you, Elias. You just bought yourself a mountain. Elias stood up. He walked to the desk, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and laid down a crisp $100 bill. He waited as Robert, shaking his head, dug into a petty cash box and handed Elias his change, a 10, 3 ones, and 3 quarters. Then, Elias pulled the 25 cents from his own pocket and handed it over, paying the exact balance. 30 minutes later, Elias walked out of the courthouse with a county-stamped receipt and a temporary deed in his coat pocket. The ice storm was still raging outside, the wind trying to push him backward. But Elias didn't feel the cold. He owned it. He actually owned it. It took 4 days for the ice storm to break and the roads to become passable again. By Saturday morning, the sun broke through the clouds, reflecting blindingly off the white-coated pines. Elias packed a thermos of coffee, a pair of heavy binoculars, and an old, unloaded Winchester rifle, more for walking stick and habit than anything else, into his truck. It was time to see his land. He drove out past the county line, taking the winding mountain roads up toward the Bitterroot foothills. The Abernathy tract didn't have an official address. It was accessed by an old, overgrown logging road that branched off Route 9. When Elias finally reached the turnoff, his heart swelled. The property was magnificent. Massive, towering Douglas firs and ponderosa pines stood like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. He could hear the distant, rushing sound of a creek cutting through the valley. It was untouched, pristine wilderness. It was a kingdom, and for $86, he was the king. He parked his truck off the shoulder, grabbed his gear, and began the hike up the ridge. He wanted to find the old Abernathy farmhouse, or what was left of it, to establish a base camp. The snow was deep, reaching his knees in places, but the crisp air filled his lungs, making him feel 20 years younger. He hiked for an hour, navigating by memory and the sun, cresting the first major ridge. As he reached the top, he paused to catch his breath. That was when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, rhythmic, mechanical, thumping sound. It sounded like a massive diesel engine. Elias frowned. The Abernathy tract was miles from the nearest active farm. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and pushed through a dense thicket of snow-covered rhododendrons, moving toward the sound. As he cleared the brush, he froze. Down in the valley, in what used to be a pristine clearing surrounded by ancient pines, was a scene of utter devastation. A massive, temporary gravel road had been bulldozed straight through the forest. Heavy machinery, excavators, flatbed trucks, and a towering skeletal drilling derrick dominated the landscape. Floodlights blared, and a dozen men in high-visibility jackets and hard hats were moving frantically around the site. Elias raised his binoculars, He focused on a massive metal sign chained to a brand new chain link fence that cordoned off the drilling area. Property of Vanguard Energy Partners. Authorized personnel only. No trespassing. Elias's blood ran cold. He lowered the binoculars. Vanguard Energy was one of the largest natural gas and mineral extraction conglomerates in the Pacific Northwest. What were they doing on his land? He didn't hide. Anger flared in his chest, hot and bright. He marched down the slope, his boots crunching loudly in the snow, heading straight for the nearest cluster of men. As he approached the fence line, a burly man in a white supervisor's hard hat spotted him. The man scowled, unclipped a radio from his belt, and walked over to intercept Elias. "Hey, hey, old man," the supervisor shouted over the roar of the diesel engines. "You can't be here. This is an active drill site. Can't you read the signs?" Elias walked right up to the chain link fence, staring the man dead in the eye. "I can read just fine, son. What I can't figure out is why you're digging holes on my property." The supervisor blinked, then let out a sharp bark of laughter. He looked Elias up and down, the worn coat, the old rifle, the grease-stained hands. "Your property? Look, buddy, I don't know if you're lost or just crazy, but this land belongs to Vanguard Energy. We hold the lease." "You hold a lease?" Elias asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Who did you sign this lease with?" "Fidelity Trust out of Chicago," the supervisor said, puffing out his chest. "Signed a 50-year mineral and surface rights lease 3 weeks ago. Paid top dollar for it. Now, turn around and walk back the way you came before I call the county sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing." Elias reached into his coat pocket. He slowly pulled out the folded county-stamped deed and held it up to the chain-link fence. "You might want to call the sheriff anyway," Elias said. "Fidelity Trust hasn't owned this land since Tuesday morning. They defaulted on their taxes. I bought the deed from Garrison County at public auction. I own the surface rights, the timber rights, and every single inch of dirt you're standing on." The supervisor's smirk vanished. He stepped closer to the fence, squinting at the official seal on the paper. "That's impossible," the supervisor muttered. "Our lawyers cleared the title last month. There were no tax liens. We made sure of it." "Your lawyers made a mistake," Elias said softly. "You have exactly 24 hours to get your equipment off my land. After that, I start charging you rent, and my rates are very, very high." The supervisor stared at him, then grabbed his radio. "Get Mr. Sterling on the line," he barked into the receiver. "We have a problem." Elias turned and began the long walk back up the ridge. He had won the auction, but the real war was just beginning. He hadn't just bought a forest. He had accidentally stumbled into a multi-million-dollar corporate land grab, and Vanguard Energy wasn't going to let an old mechanic stand in their way. The storm had passed, but the chill in the air over Garrison County had only deepened. Elias Calloway sat on his front porch the morning after his confrontation on the ridge, nursing a mug of black coffee. He watched the breath plume from his lips, rising into the frigid air. He knew they were coming. Men with money didn't just pack up their toys and walk away because an old man waved a piece of paper at them. Sure enough, at exactly 9 o'clock, a convoy of 3 sleek black Cadillac Escalades crunched their way up Elias's unpaved, snow-rutted driveway. They looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of his peeling red barn and rusted tractor parts. 4 men stepped out. 3 of them were built like linebackers, wearing dark overcoats and mirrored sunglasses despite the overcast sky. The 4th man was different. He was sharp, tailored, and moved with the predatory grace of a man entirely too comfortable destroying lives. He carried a leather briefcase that likely cost more than Elias's pickup truck. Elias didn't stand up. He just took another slow sip of his coffee. "Mr. Calloway," the man said, his voice smooth and practiced, projecting perfectly across the snow. "My name is Bradley Paxton. I am senior legal counsel for Vanguard Energy Partners. May I step onto your porch?" "You can stand right where you are, Mr. Paxton," Elias replied, his voice gravelly. "The snow builds character." Paxton offered a tight, patronizing smile. He didn't step onto the wood. Instead, he unlatched his briefcase, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Mr. Calloway, I understand there was a bit of a misunderstanding yesterday up on Abernathy Ridge. My site supervisor informed me that you purchased a tax deed for the property." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," Elias said. "It was an eviction notice." Paxton chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Calloway, let me be frank. We are a multi-billion-dollar corporation. We signed a binding, 50-year lease with Fidelity Trust. The county's failure to notify Fidelity of a trivial $80 tax assessment is a procedural error. We have already filed a motion in district court to invalidate your deed based on lack of due process. Montana law requires 3 notices sent to the address of record," Elias stated, quoting the legal codes he had memorized at his kitchen table. "If the mail bounces back, the county publishes the notice in the paper for 3 weeks. Fidelity Trust dissolved 3 years ago. There was nobody to notify. The law was followed to the letter." Paxton's smile faded entirely. His eyes turned cold. "You've done your homework, but you don't seem to understand how this works. Even if your deed holds up, which it won't, our lease predates your purchase. Furthermore, I hold in my hand a temporary restraining order signed by a judge in Missoula at 2 o'clock this morning, barring you from coming within 500 yards of our drill site. If you step foot on that ridge again, you will be arrested." Elias set his coffee mug down on the wooden railing. The dull thunk echoed in the quiet morning. "You're trespassing on my land, tearing up my timber, and you bring me a piece of paper telling me to stay away?" Elias asked, his tone dropping dangerously low. Paxton held out the envelope. "There is another piece of paper in here, Elias. A cashier's check. $50,000. That's more money than you've seen in a decade, I imagine. Sign a quitclaim deed, transferring the property to Vanguard, take the money, and go buy yourself a condo in Florida. If you refuse, we will bury you in litigation. We will drag this out until your pension is drained, your farm is foreclosed on to pay legal fees, and you die of old age in a courtroom. Your choice." Elias stood up. He walked slowly down the 3 wooden steps of his porch, closing the distance between himself and the corporate lawyer. The 3 bodyguards tensed, but Paxton held up a hand. Elias didn't look at the envelope. He looked at Paxton's polished Italian leather shoes, currently sinking into the Montana mud. "Mr. Paxton," Elias said quietly, "my wife is buried in the cemetery 2 miles down the road. I rebuilt the engine of that Ford in the barn with my own 2 hands. I know every rock and every pine tree in this valley. I'm not going to Florida, and I'm not selling my mountain to a man who thinks he can scare me with a briefcase. Elias turned around and walked back up the steps. You have 23 hours left to get your machines off my land. Now get off my property before I introduce you to my 12 gauge. Paxton's jaw tightened. He tossed the envelope onto the snow. You're making a terrible mistake, old man. The Escalades backed out of the driveway, leaving deep, muddy scars in the snow. Elias watched them go. He picked up the envelope, pulled out the restraining order, and read it over. He didn't look at the check. He walked back inside, picked up his rotary phone, and dialed a number he hadn't called in 15 years. Tom, Elias said when the line clicked open. It's Elias Calloway. I need a lawyer, a mean one. Tobias Dempsey was not a man who looked like he could take down a multi-billion-dollar energy conglomerate. He operated his law practice out of a converted strip mall storefront situated between a failing laundromat and a bowling alley in downtown Garrison. Tom was 68, possessed a spectacular comb-over, and had a desk piled so high with case files it looked like a paper fortress. But 30 years ago, Tom had been the sharpest prosecuting attorney in the state, until a heart attack and a divorce drove him into quiet, small-town private practice. Elias had fixed Tom's transmission for free back in the 90s when Tom was broke. Tom never forgot a debt. When Elias dropped the Vanguard injunction on Tom's desk, the lawyer put on his reading glasses, read the document twice, and let out a long, low whistle. Elias, you didn't just poke a bear. You crawled into the cave and set its bed on fire, Tom muttered, rubbing his stubbled chin. Vanguard Energy? They employ more lawyers than Garrison County employs people. Can they invalidate my deed? Elias asked, sitting rigid in the uncomfortable plastic guest chair. Unlikely, Tom said, flipping through the pages. You were right about the tax code. The county crossed all their T's. It's an ironclad tax sale. But Paxton isn't bluffing about the litigation. They'll file injunction after injunction. They'll try to enforce their lease. If they tie this up in court, they can keep drilling while the judge decides who has the right of way. And by the time the dust settles, they'll have extracted whatever it is they want, and the land will be worthless. Elias frowned. That's the thing, Tom. I worked on diesel rigs back in the 70s. I know what a natural gas drilling operation looks like. The derrick they have up there, it's wrong. The bore diameter is too wide, and they aren't laying pipeline infrastructure. They aren't trying to extract gas. They're trying to dig a massive, shallow hole very quickly. Tom looked up, his eyes narrowing. Why would Vanguard spend millions to dig a hole on a worthless patch of timberland? I don't know, Elias said, but the Abernathy family owned that land until 1981. What happened in 1981? Tom stood up and walked over to a battered filing cabinet. The Abernathy lumber mill went bankrupt. There was a massive scandal. A chemical fire at their treatment plant on the edge of the county. The EPA got involved, but the family dissolved the company and transferred the assets to a blind trust in Chicago before the federal fines could hit. Fidelity Trust, Elias said, the pieces clicking together in his mind. Exactly, Tom said, pulling out a dusty file. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the faded newspaper clippings. The EPA always suspected that the Abernathys didn't just burn their chemicals. They suspected they buried hundreds of barrels of toxic wood preservatives, creosote, arsenic, pentachlorophenol, somewhere in the mountains before the feds arrived. The room went dead silent. "Vanguard isn't an energy company," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Or, at least, they aren't just an energy company. Didn't they acquire a bunch of old industrial holding companies in a merger last year?" Tom typed frantically on his bulky desktop computer. A minute later, he gasped. Yes, Vanguard absorbed the parent company that originally shielded the Abernathy assets. Elias, under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, the Superfund law, whoever holds the liability for that buried waste is responsible for the cleanup. And the EPA just announced last month that they are doing deep soil water testing across Garrison County for the new reservoir, Elias finished. If the EPA finds those barrels, Vanguard is on the hook for $1 billion cleanup, plus criminal negligence charges, Tom said, his face pale. They aren't drilling for gas. They're trying to secretly excavate and incinerate the toxic barrels before the EPA water testers arrive next week. They bought a fake mineral lease from the dead trust as a cover story to bring heavy excavation equipment onto the land. Elias felt a cold fury settle in his chest. They weren't just stealing his land. They were poisoning the water table of the entire county, and they were going to cover it up and leave the scarred earth behind. "Tom," Elias said, standing up, "we need to get the EPA out here, today." "We can't," Tom sighed, throwing his pen down. "We have no proof, just a theory. If we call the EPA, Vanguard will stall them at the gate with lawyers for 48 hours. By the time federal agents get a warrant to inspect the site, Vanguard will have dug up the barrels, loaded them onto sealed flatbeds, and vanished. We need to stop those machines from digging." Elias looked out the window of the law office toward the distant snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroots. He thought about the pristine creek running through his land. He thought about the arrogance of men like Bradley Paxton. "You file a counter-injunction to freeze their operations," Elias said, his voice hard as iron. "Give them hell in the courtroom, Tom. Keep Paxton distracted." "And what are you going to do?" Tom asked, looking alarmed. Elias pulled his worn leather gloves out of his coat pocket. "I'm a mechanic, Tom. I'm going to go do some maintenance." The temperature on Abernathy Ridge had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero by midnight. The wind howled through the Douglas firs, carrying the bitter sting of ice. Despite the Missoula judge's temporary restraining order freezing activity on the site until a hearing could be held on Monday, the Vanguard camp was fully illuminated. Massive halogen floodlights cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thump-thump-thump of heavy diesel generators echoed off the canyon walls. Vanguard was not waiting for Monday. They had brought in a massive, tracked excavator, a machine the size of a 2-story house, and were aggressively tearing into the frozen earth near the creek bed. Elias Calloway lay flat on his stomach on a snow-covered ridge overlooking the site, shivering despite his heavy wool coat. Through his binoculars, he watched the operation. They had already dug a trench 40 feet deep. Beside the trench sat 3 massive unmarked flatbed trucks, their engines idling, waiting for a payload. He checked his pocket watch. It was 1:15 a.m. Elias didn't carry a gun. He carried a heavy canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder. He knew that if Vanguard caught him, he would be arrested for violating a federal injunction, trespassing, and likely domestic terrorism, given the lawyers they employed. But he also knew that if that excavator hit those buried chemical barrels and ruptured them, the creek would carry the poison straight into the town's water supply. Elias began his descent. He didn't walk on the crunching snow. He moved from tree to tree, stepping only on the exposed, frozen granite outcroppings to mask his footprints. He had hunted these woods for 50 years. He was a ghost in the timber. He slipped past the outer perimeter fence where 2 private security guards were huddled inside a running pickup truck, trying to stay warm. Elias moved like a shadow, creeping toward the massive generator array powering the floodlights and the drilling equipment. He didn't want to destroy their equipment. He wanted to paralyze it. Elias knelt beside the primary diesel generator, a roaring beast of a machine. He unzipped his tool bag. To the untrained eye, a generator of this size was an impenetrable fortress of steel and wire. To Elias, it was just an engine. It needed air, fuel, and compression. He didn't touch the fuel lines. That would cause a spill, and he was here to prevent one. Instead, he reached for a specialized crescent wrench. He located the high-pressure fuel injector pump. With practiced surgical precision, Elias bypassed the tamper seals and loosened the bleed valves on the injector lines just enough to let a microscopic amount of air into the system. Diesel engines cannot run with air in their fuel lines. They become vapor-locked. The fix requires hours of bleeding the lines with specialized tools. Elias gave the valve one final twist, closed the housing, and melted back into the shadows. 5 minutes later, the massive generator sputtered. The engine knocked violently, a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil, and then died. Half of the floodlights went pitch black. The power to the drilling derrick cut out with a mechanical groan. Shouts erupted across the camp. Men with flashlights began running toward the generator. "Get it back online," a voice roared. It was Logan, the burly head of security Elias had met days ago. "We have to hit the bedrock by dawn." While the camp was distracted, Elias moved toward the real threat. The massive excavator parked near the trench. The operator had stepped out of the cab to see what was happening with the lights. Elias scrambled up the steel tracks of the massive machine, his spiked boots gripping the frozen metal. He opened the side access panel to the hydraulic engine bay. The heat coming off the engine was immense. He knew exactly what to look for. He found the primary hydraulic flow manifold. He didn't cut the thick, reinforced hoses. He simply removed the specialized cotter pins from the main linkage arms and slipped them into his pocket. Without those pins, the moment the operator tried to lift the massive steel bucket, the linkage would safely disengage, rendering the arm completely useless, but without spilling a single drop of toxic hydraulic fluid onto the snow. Elias closed the panel and began to climb down. "Hey!" The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight hit Elias square in the face, temporarily blinding him. He froze on the tracks of the excavator. "Hands in the air, right now!" Logan shouted, drawing a heavy baton from his belt. 2 other security contractors rushed over, pulling zip ties from their vests. Elias slowly raised his hands, the cold wind biting at his exposed face. He climbed down from the machine, completely surrounded. Logan marched up to him, his face purple with rage. "You stupid old man. I told you what would happen if you came back here. You just violated a court order. We're going to lock you up for the rest of your miserable life." Logan grabbed Elias by the shoulder, roughly spinning him around and pinning his chest against the cold steel of the excavator. "Check the machines! See what he did!" Logan yelled to his men. A mechanic ran over to the generator, frantically inspecting it. "Boss, the fuel lines are vapor-locked. Somebody bled the pressure out. It'll take us 6 hours to reprime the system," Logan snarled, pressing his forearm against the back of Elias's neck. "You're done, Calloway." "I think," Elias said, his voice remarkably calm despite being pinned, "you should look up at the ridge." Logan frowned, keeping his grip tight on Elias, and turned his head. At the top of the ridge, where the old logging road met the clearing, a line of red and blue flashing lights cut through the darkness. 3 Garrison County Sheriff's cruisers came bouncing down the rutted road, their sirens silent, but their lights blazing. Behind them, a dark, unmarked government SUV was crawling down the slope. "What the hell is this?" Logan hissed, backing away from Elias. Sheriff Boyd, a tall man with a thick gray mustache, stepped out of the lead cruiser. He had his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. Behind him, Tobias Dempsey stepped out of the cruiser's passenger side, holding a thick folder. 2 men in windbreakers bearing the letters EPA stepped out of the government SUV. "Sheriff," Logan yelled, walking forward. "Thank God you're here. This man is trespassing and sabotaging our equipment. He's in violation of a federal injunction." Sheriff Boyd walked past Logan, his boots crunching in the snow. He looked at Elias, who was brushing the snow off his coat, and then looked at the massive trench dug into the earth. "Well, Mr. Calloway," Sheriff Boyd said slowly, "did you sabotage their equipment?" "I performed unsolicited maintenance on machinery parked illegally on my property," Elias replied evenly. "I'd send them an invoice, but I doubt they'd pay it." Logan laughed in disbelief. "Sheriff, arrest him." "I'm afraid I can't do that, son," Sheriff Boyd said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his heavy jacket. "You see, while you boys were out here digging in the dark, Judge Harmon held an emergency midnight hearing in Garrison. Tom here presented compelling evidence that Vanguard Energy secured a lease under false pretenses to mask illegal, hazardous waste disposal." Tom Dempsey stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "The temporary restraining order against Mr. Calloway has been vacated. In its place, the court has issued a hard stop on all Vanguard operations, pending an immediate ground-penetrating radar scan by the Environmental Protection Agency." Logan's face drained of color. He looked at the EPA agents, who were already pulling testing equipment from the trunk of their SUV. "You can't do this," Logan stammered, pulling out his radio. "I need to call Mr. Paxton." "You can call the President of the United States if you want," Sheriff Boyd said, his voice hard. "But if a single piece of heavy machinery moves on this property before the feds finish their work, I will arrest every single man wearing a hard hat. Do you understand me?" Logan looked at the dead generator. He looked at the crippled excavator. He knew it was over. If the machines couldn't dig the barrels out tonight, the EPA would find them by sunrise. Elias picked up his canvas tool bag from the snow. He walked over to Tom, patting the lawyer on the shoulder. "Good work, Tom," Elias said quietly. "You cut it close, Elias," Tom whispered back, looking at the massive hole in the ground. If they had dug another 10 feet, they didn't, Elias said. He turned and looked out over the dark expanse of the forest. The wind was dying down, and the first faint hints of purple dawn were beginning to crack over the Bitterroot peaks. It was still freezing, but the air smelled clean. It smelled like pine and dirt and victory. He had bought a mountain for $86. And tonight, he had proved he deserved to own it. The dawn breaking over the Bitterroot Mountains painted the snow-covered valley in shades of pale violet and bruised orange. The biting wind had finally died down, leaving an eerie, freezing stillness over the Abernathy tract. Down in the valley, the Vanguard Energy drill site looked less like a corporate operation and more like a crime scene. Sheriff Boyd had kept his word. His deputies had formed a perimeter around the massive trench, their hands resting near their duty belts, keeping Logan and his furious security contractors boxed in near their idling trucks. At the edge of the pit, 2 Environmental Protection Agency field agents, Hamilton and Reynolds, were meticulously sweeping a heavy, sled-like device over the frozen dirt. It was a high-frequency ground-penetrating radar, GPR unit, specifically calibrated for detecting subterranean metallic density. Elias stood next to Tom Dempsey on the ridge, a thermos of fresh, scalding black coffee clutched in his stiff hands. He watched the EPA agents work with the quiet patience of a man who had spent his life waiting out bad weather and stubborn livestock. "If they don't find anything, Elias," Tom muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air, "Paxton is going to have us both brought up on federal interference charges. That judge in Missoula is already furious about the midnight injunction." "They'll find it," Elias said, taking a sip of coffee. "Men like Roman Abernathy didn't drag barrels of poison up a mountain just to take them back down." Down in the trench, Agent Hamilton suddenly stopped pulling the sled. He stared at the digital readout strapped to his chest harness. He tapped the screen, his brow furrowing beneath his heavy-knit cap. "Reynolds," Hamilton called out, his voice carrying sharply up the ridge. "I've got a massive anomaly. Depth is shallow, maybe 12 feet below the current trench floor. It's a clustered grid, high ferrous signature." Reynolds hurried over with a specialized, long-handled soil auger. He positioned the heavy steel bit over the spot Hamilton marked with orange spray paint and leaned his weight onto the handles, twisting the auger deep into the frozen earth. He pulled up a core sample, tapped it into a sterilized glass vial, and walked over to a portable spectrometer resting on the tailgate of their SUV. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the valley was the pinging of cooling diesel engines and the distant rush of the creek. Then, the spectrometer beeped. Agent Reynolds stared at the tiny LCD screen. He slowly took off his safety glasses and looked up at Sheriff Boyd. "Sheriff," Reynolds said, his voice deadly serious. "The soil core is completely saturated with pentachlorophenol, creosote, and trace amounts of polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. The concentration is off the charts. It's a lethal cocktail. If that excavator had dug another 10 feet and ruptured the primary cluster, this entire valley's aquifer would have been poisoned by noon." Logan, the security chief, went pale. He took a step backward, suddenly looking very small inside his heavy tactical coat. Sheriff Boyd didn't hesitate. He unclipped his radio. "Dispatch, this is Boyd. I need hazmat units from Missoula and Helena rolling my way right now. Contact the state governor's office and tell them we have a level 1 Superfund emergency. Boyd turned to his deputies. Arrest them, all of them. Criminal endangerment, illegal dumping, and violation of the Clean Water Act. Wait, Logan yelled, as a deputy grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. We didn't know. We were just hired to provide security for a drill site. We don't know anything about chemicals. Tell it to the federal prosecutor, son, Boyd said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. By 9 o'clock that morning, the quiet county road leading to the Abernathy tract was choked with flashing lights. News vans from Missoula and Spokane were setting up satellite dishes in the snow. Men in full-body yellow hazmat suits were cordoning off the valley with miles of red tape. Elias and Tom were standing near Elias's battered Ford F-15. Oh, when the 3 black Cadillac Escalades returned. Bradley Paxton stepped out of the lead vehicle, but the smug, predatory arrogance he had worn the day before was entirely gone. His expensive overcoat looked rumpled, and his face was drawn and ashen. He had clearly been on the phone with corporate headquarters all morning. Paxton marched toward the police line, holding his briefcase like a shield. Sheriff Boyd, Agent Hamilton, I demand you halt this farce immediately. Vanguard Energy had no prior knowledge of any subterranean hazards. We are a victim of the Abernathy Estate's deception. Agent Hamilton walked up to the yellow tape, pulling off his heavy gloves. Mr. Paxton, save the corporate spin for the press conference. We pulled the metadata on your company's excavation permits. You ordered heavy-duty chemical containment flatbeds from a logistics company in Idaho 3 weeks ago. You knew exactly what was in the ground, and you tried to secretly dig it up and incinerate it before the county water testing began. Paxton's jaw locked. He looked over at Elias, pure venom in his eyes. You think you've won, old man? Paxton sneered, stepping close to the tape. You have no idea what you've just done. Vanguard is a multi-billion-dollar entity. We will tie this up in appellate courts until you're in the ground. We will claim you planted the evidence. We will bury you. Elias met Paxton's gaze without blinking. You can't bury anything else on my mountain, Mr. Paxton. The dirt's full. The fallout was catastrophic and immediate. Within 48 hours, the story of the $86 mountain had hit the national news cycle. The image of a 72-year-old retired mechanic standing down a massive corporate excavator in the dead of night captured the public's imagination. Environmental groups rallied in Garrison County, holding candlelight vigils outside the courthouse. But behind the closed doors of Vanguard Energy's glass and steel skyscraper in Chicago, it was a bloodbath. Jonathan Hayes, the CEO of Vanguard, stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse boardroom. He was a man who measured his life in quarterly earnings and stock options. Right now, both were evaporating. Vanguard stock had plummeted 22% in 3 days. The Department of Justice had just announced a preliminary criminal investigation into the company's executive board. How did this happen? Hayes whispered, not turning away from the Chicago skyline. Behind him, a team of 6 panic-stricken lawyers, including a very quiet Bradley Paxton, sat around a mahogany table. Sir, Paxton started, his voice trembling slightly. The Fidelity Trust acquisition was supposed to be airtight. We acquired the holding company, found the liability, the Abernathy Chemicals, and initiated a quiet, off-the-books cleanup. We secured the mineral lease. We had the equipment. It was a 3-day operation. We didn't account for a local tax glitch. Hayes turned around. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. You didn't account for a tax glitch, an $86 bill. You let a senile mechanic buy the land out from under us, and then you tried to strong-arm him with a fake drill crew? We filed the injunctions. You filed yourselves into a federal indictment, Hayes roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The EPA has seized our equipment. The FBI is subpoenaing our internal emails. Do you understand the liability we are facing? The Superfund cleanup alone will cost us $800 million. The federal fines will bankrupt our Western Division. A senior crisis management consultant cleared his throat at the end of the table. Mr. Hayes, we have one play left. Callaway is suing us in civil court for trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress. If we can get him to settle quietly and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, if we can get him to state publicly that Vanguard was genuinely unaware of the chemicals and was acting in good faith, it will neuter the DOJ's criminal intent case. We can write off the cleanup as an unfortunate inheritance from the Abernathy era. Hayes rubbed his temples. What's the old man asking for? His lawyer, Dempsey, hasn't named a number, the consultant said. But he's a small-town grease monkey. He bought the land for pocket change. Offer him $10 million. Offer him 20. Give him enough money to buy his own private island and make this go away. Hayes straightened his tie. Get my jet ready. I'm going to Montana. The Rusty Spoon Diner in downtown Garrison smelled of burnt hash browns, stale coffee, and old grease. It was exactly the kind of place Jonathan Hayes despised. He sat in a cracked vinyl booth, wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit that cost more than the diner's annual revenue. 2 massive bodyguards stood by the door, making the local patrons extremely nervous. The bell above the door jingled. Elias Callaway walked in, wearing the same heavy wool coat, grease-stained jeans, and worn work boots he wore every day. Tom Dempsey trailed behind him, clutching a battered leather briefcase. Elias didn't look intimidated. He looked tired. He slid into the booth opposite Hayes. Tom sat next to him. Mr. Callaway, Hayes said, offering a practiced, empathetic smile. He didn't extend his hand. He knew Elias wouldn't shake it. I want to personally apologize for the behavior of my legal team. Mr. Paxton acted unilaterally and aggressively, and his employment with Vanguard has been terminated. I came all this way because I believe reasonable men can find a reasonable solution. Elias looked at the waitress. Just a black coffee, Betty. Thanks. He turned his gray eyes back to the CEO. I don't care about your lawyers, Mr. Hayes. I care about my mountain. Hayes nodded smoothly. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. He slid it across the sticky diner table. I understand that, Elias. And Vanguard wants to make this right, Hayes said softly. That is a binding settlement agreement. Vanguard Energy will pay you $35 million, tax-free, wired directly into an account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. In exchange, you drop the civil suit, sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding our internal operations, and you issue a joint press release stating that Vanguard was a victim of the Abernathy estate's hidden history. Tom Dempsey looked at the paper. His eyes went wide. $35 million. It was an unfathomable amount of money. He looked at Elias, waiting for the old man's reaction. Elias picked up the paper. He didn't read it. He just held it in his calloused hands, feeling the weight of the cardstock. $35 million, Elias murmured. That's a lot of money to buy a lie. It's enough money to change your family's life for generations, Hayes countered smoothly. You've won, Elias. You beat the big corporation. Take the trophy. Go live out your years in luxury. Elias set the paper down and slowly pushed it back across the table. I don't have a family left to leave it to, Mr. Hayes. My wife is gone. We couldn't have kids, and I'm too old to learn how to be rich, Elias said, his voice steady and calm. But I do have a home, and the people in this valley are my neighbors. Hayes' smile faltered slightly. Elias, I'm trying to be generous, but if you refuse this, Vanguard will drag this civil suit out for a decade. We will bury you in paperwork. You don't have a decade, Tom Dempsey interjected, opening his briefcase. During the discovery phase of the injunction, we subpoenaed the communication logs between Vanguard's logistics division and the Idaho Trucking Company. We have the emails, Hayes. You authorized the secret excavation. You knew about the poison. If we go to trial, those emails become public record. The DOJ won't just fine you. They will send you to federal prison. Hayes stared at Tom, the color slowly draining from his face. The polished corporate facade cracked, revealing the desperate, cornered man underneath. What do you want? Hayes asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. If you don't want money, what the hell do you want? Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. First, Elias said, Vanguard pays for the EPA cleanup, in full, with no legal stalling. Every single barrel comes out of that mountain safely. That's standard Superfund procedure, Hayes gritted out. Done. Second, Elias continued, your company is going to build a state-of-the-art municipal water purification plant for Garrison County. Fully funded, with a trust set up to pay for its maintenance for the next 50 years. You're going to guarantee that the drinking water in this town stays cleaner than bottled rain. Hayes swallowed hard. A municipal plant? That's a $40 million infrastructure project. You just offered me $35 to keep my mouth shut. Consider it a reallocation of funds, Elias said, without missing a beat. And finally, the mineral lease. Vanguard holds a 50-year lease on those 320 acres. I want it voided. I want all corporate claims to the Abernathy tract dissolved. If we void the lease, you just own a patch of worthless poisoned dirt, Hayes argued, genuinely confused. You can't build on it. You can't log it. The EPA will have it locked down for 5 years. It won't belong to me, Elias said, sitting back in the booth. Tom is drafting the paperwork tomorrow. I'm transferring the deed to the Montana State Parks Department. The Abernathy Tract is going to become the Martha Callaway State Conservation Area. It will never be drilled, never be logged, and never be sold again. It belongs to the trees. Hayes stared at the old man. He realized, with a sinking feeling of absolute defeat, that he couldn't buy Elias Callaway. You can't bribe a man who only wants to protect his home. Slowly, Hayes reached into his pocket, pulled out an expensive gold fountain pen, and looked at Tom Dempsey. Draw up the contracts, Hayes whispered. "We have a deal." It took 4 years for the Environmental Protection Agency to fully excavate, remediate, and restore the Abernathy Tract. They pulled over 600 barrels of toxic sludge from the earth, neutralizing a threat that had silently loomed over Garrison County for nearly half a century. Vanguard Energy survived the scandal, but just barely. Their CEO resigned in disgrace, and the company was forced to pay billions in federal penalties. True to the settlement, a gleaming new water purification facility was built on the outskirts of town, ensuring that the taps in Garrison County ran pure and safe. Elias Callaway didn't attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the water plant. He didn't care for crowds or politicians looking for photo opportunities. Instead, on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in late October, Elias drove his old Ford F-15 up the winding mountain road, out past the county line. He parked near the new, heavy wooden sign that marked the entrance to the trail. Martha Caldwell State Conservation Area, Protected Wilderness. Elias stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the fallen pine needles. The heavy machinery was long gone. The scars in the earth had been filled with fresh soil and seeded with native grasses. The massive Douglas firs stood tall and proud, the wind whispering through their branches like a deep, ancient breath. He walked over to the edge of the ridge and looked down at the pristine creek, its waters running clear and cold over the smooth river stones. Elias reached into his heavy wool coat pocket. His fingers brushed against a framed, laminated receipt. It was faded and the county ink was starting to blur, but the numbers were still perfectly legible. $86.24. He smiled, a quiet, satisfied expression that settled into the deep lines of his face. He had lost his wife, and he lived in a quiet, drafty house. But as he looked out over the 320 acres of saved, silent wilderness, Elias Callaway knew he was the wealthiest man in Montana. He turned up his collar against the chill, turned his back to the wind, and began the long, peaceful walk home. What an incredible saga of grit, the law, and the ultimate underdog victory. Elias Callaway proved that you don't need a Wall Street bank account to stand up to corporate greed. Sometimes all you need is an ironclad knowledge of the county tax code, a good mechanic's intuition, and the courage to hold your ground. $86 bought him a mountain, but his bravery saved a town. If you were captivated by Elias's fight to protect the Abernathy Tract, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a true David and Goliath story, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas.